Hey everyone, and welcome to the Curious Refuge podcast. I'm Fred Grinstein. Amidst the explosions of creativity over the last year with generative AI, one of the still lesser charted frontiers is the intersection with nonfiction content, documentaries, unscripted storytelling, something we explore in depth in the class I teach for Curious Refuge, exploring with eyes wide open, how does synthetic content work in a medium built on authenticity? For many, the first time they encountered AI in documentaries was in Roadrunner, a film about the late Anthony Bourdain. In one brief but controversial section, the filmmaker, Oscar winner Morgan Neville, used AI to generate Bourdain's voice. The backlash was swift and fierce, sparking debates about ethics, consent, and the implications of the new technology. Since then, AI has continued to blur the lines between memory and innovation. Films like Goliath that similarly cloned the late basketball legend Wilt Chamberlain's voice, and Andrew Rossi's Netflix series The Andy Warhol Diaries that brought the artist's diaries to life with generative audio. These projects and others have leaned into this emergent trend, exploring how AI can bring back famous voices, faces, and personas from the past. Notably, these last examples took great lengths to be transparent and gain consent from estates and living descendants. But this remarkable technological capability to clone someone's voice so realistically and not far behind to do the same with their likeness and lifelike presence, it brings up a host of emotions and questions, not least of which is how these AI-generated recreations affect our collective memory and our trust in storytelling. The reaction isn't always positive. Recently, Sir David Attenborough expressed being profoundly disturbed after discovering AI creators had been cloning his voice in news reports on YouTube channels covering the Ukraine-Russia war and U.S. politics, an understandable sentiment from someone who's synonymous with the very real natural world. The greater sin is, of course, that this is being done without his permission. But the response he gives speaks for a lot of people's emotions first encountering this product of this amazing technology. But does that change over time? Since the uproar over Roadrunner, subsequent projects haven't sparked the same backlash, most recently with Netflix's Churchill series produced by Ron Howard's Imagine Entertainment. Could it be that audiences are adapting? Or perhaps when done right, could this kind of storytelling even be embraced? That brings us to Benjamin Field, an award-winning filmmaker, producer, and co-founder of Deep Fusion Films. In addition to his creative work, Benjamin is also helping shape policy and best practices around the use of AI in storytelling, navigating the complex and ethical and creative terrain this technology presents. He's carving a bold path in this evolving intersection of AI and nonfiction just in the last month or so with not one, but two trailblazing projects. One is a podcast hosted by a deceased celebrity brought back to life with generative AI. The other, a documentary featuring an iconic character from episode 4 of Star Wars, who was also brought back from the dead.
AI is being used for scripting, for shooting and producing movies.
AI is being used for everything.
Hollywood production is being transformed by artificial intelligence.
Ben, thrilled to have you on the show. First off, are you particularly fond of the story of Lazarus? There's a theme here. I just have to call it out. What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, clearly that's just the way that my life goes these days. It's not the only thing as well. You know, I mean, God, if you go back far enough in my history, I've done it lots, but sort of accidentally carved out a niche, I suppose. And you know, that's it's never been intentional, but you know, those. I think it's always a thing, isn't it? That once you've done something, somebody then assumes, oh, well, okay, then you can just do that again, but you can do it for this, or you can do it for this, and so you do end up just sort of reiterating what you've done. And
so you're owning the dead people space. You got it.
Apparently so. Somebody the other day referred to me as a digital grave robber, which I thought was God. Just awful. But then that's Twitter for you. So, you know, I will.
So I'm guessing that isn't like daddy comes to work, to school to tell everybody what he does for work. That's not the way you lead in that.
No. Funnily enough, my daughter hasn't outed me as that just yet. But there's, you know, hey, there's still time, right? I mean, you know.
Right. But kidding aside, and I in some ways I'm joking, but it is what is remarkable and worth noting. And on both sides, there's what some people call controversy, what some people call incredible innovation. Like, you're also in a moment, you're talking to a lot of press about this stuff. If people Google your name, let's talk about Michael Parkinson, because that is probably the most notably noisy thing. And I did get a taste of it with Jason Derulo, which we'll have available for our YouTube listeners and regular listeners. But for folks that aren't from the UK, if you could also introduce who Michael Parkinson is and what this project is all about.
Yeah, so Michael Parkinson, I suppose, is the UK's answer to Johnny Carson, isn't it? I suppose, he is the iconic interviewer from, the 1970s who had a career that spanned, 3 decades, interviewing A-listers, notable people, just anybody who was fascinating in the public consciousness was interviewed by Michael Parkinson, either on the BBC, or on ITV, and did very, very well in Australia as well. So, yeah, he just became a household name and sort of now, is seen by many as being a national treasure, or was until his death last year. And I think, he says, segueing beautifully into the furor that sort of followed all of this, the fact that we seemingly were resurrecting, he says in inverted commas, a national treasure, of course, fueled some of the fire on what the backlash was. And of course, as soon as you enter that space, the truth goes out the window and facts don't matter because the headlines are all anybody's ever interested in. So, actually, I'm very, very interested to see from your perspective, actually, Fred. So when you first heard it, or you heard the headlines about it, what was your immediate take?
From where I'm sitting, I felt that this is an inevitability when I think about what a lot of this technology and like 11 Labs and a lot of these conversational AI. And I think this moment in December of 24, it seems only louder. And kudos to you that you took the experiment by the horn and executed it. But I think, so I did have a bit of a perspective that I was looking for this, that I sensed this is what AI can do. But then also, very interestingly, audio content. I think like we spent a lot of time talking about documentary films. In a lot of ways, those were all audio experiments, some of those early examples. I thought it was very intriguing that you went for the really commercial setting of a podcast. So I had multiple reactions.
Yeah. So, I think so. The interesting word you used there, and we can unpick the podcast element of that in and of itself, because I think that is valuable. But interesting, the word you used there was experiment. And actually, when the show was leaked, actually, by a tabloid newspaper in the UK, nobody saw it as an experiment, and everybody saw it as dead celebrity hosts podcast, interviewing new people. So this was, in a very real sense, portrayed as, oh, look, AI has taken a presenting job. It's taken something from a human, and AI is replacing us. Oh, my God, the end is nigh. Terminator is just around the corner. And what's interesting is the fact that nobody read in to all the information that I was giving the journalists at the time. All right, at the point that it was leaked, I completely understand that, you only get a top line because that's what somebody's heard. But the minute I was interviewed, I gave everybody the context. But yet still the headlines perpetuated the idea that this was, it's just new. It's new interviews, but now it's being done by an AI. Whereas actually the purpose behind it was to explore the relationship between AI and human. So what is it to be human? What is it to be interviewed by an AI? How does that change the dynamic of the interview space? What does it do? And so you're absolutely right. From our perspective, this was an experiment. When when we were doing all of the PR for it, our PR comms lead said, "Whatever you do, don't call it a social experiment, because it will kill the vibe of it completely." And that's fair. She does have a point to that. But I will also say that there is an element of it being a human experiment. It is to understand what happens when you are not confronted by somebody who judges, or you can read micro expressions from, as that are either confirming what you're saying, as you now are nodding to say, yes, I agree with you, continue, you're encouraging me to speak. Whereas, and now you're staying very still, so you don't give me anything. But then the reverse is also true, that you can tell when somebody wants to interject, which changes the dynamic of the interview, because you then go, I'll wrap up because I want to know what they're going to say next. But an AI interview doesn't give you any of that. our AI interview just listens, and it only listens to the words you say. It doesn't bring context into it. It doesn't do, it doesn't come with any sort of bias or anything else. It is purely open. And that's what we wanted to explore. We wanted to understand that. And, I got beaten up in the press for nearly 10 days over this until Richard Osman, who, I don't know if your listeners are going to know who Richard Osman is, but Richard Osman is a very prominent and very well thought of TV exec and author and a host on The Rest is Entertainment, which is a podcast in the UK. And it millions of listeners. And he did a piece on deep fusion films, virtually Parkinson, and myself, and it covered for 20 minutes, going into in depth as to what this was. And he really got it. It's like, he looked at it and went, actually, this is brilliant. This is exploratory, and at that moment, and only at that moment, did things change for us, where suddenly everybody else started to take notice. And that, I'm sure, as you say, that idea of being in the moment, or of the moment, or whatever the lovely expression was you used, that kind of has only become possible because of somebody actually taking notice of what we were doing, rather than going with the headline grabbers. So that, that I think is really important, because the public perception versus the intent, the creative intent, were two very, very different things for quite a while. And so you get to a point where you say, right, what is the purpose of using Michael Parkinson? Well, Michael Parkinson was a really warm, natural interviewer, and he was able to bring something with his voice and his persona that put his guests at ease. So he is the natural foil to AI, which is, cold and uncaring, or seen as cold and uncaring. And so, once you're tied into that voice, you then explore that relationship in a way that feels very natural. And what we've discovered is actually the most fascinating thing, which is that all the interviews so far have, to some degree, been almost therapeutic, because so we do each one in person. So we never allow them to be in their own comfort zone, if you like, where there are other distractions, like the fact that my daughter came down the stairs a moment ago and obviously distracted me momentarily. So we bring them into the booth, and we put the headphones on, and we leave them in the booth. So all the rest of the team, audio engineers and all the rest of it, go outside, and we leave them there. And then all they've got is their own head and the headphones with Parky in. And it becomes therapy in some way, because they only ever give away what they're happy to give away. And so what was interesting with Jason Derulo is actually, so Jason was our first official guest. And he doesn't really give anything away about his father in interviews typically. And yet, actually, he started to give stuff away about his father in our interview. And there was a moment where you can kind of see that it starts to click with him, that actually he's starting to give more away because he's relaxing into it. And so, the first half of the interview, he gives these very long, verbose kind of answers where you really gets into the spirit of things and all that. And then there's a moment where I think he realizes that actually he's giving stuff away, and the answers start to become shorter, and he starts to take control of the interview a bit more. But it's interesting, that first half is very different.
I have so many questions.
And of course, we didn't even pick up on the podcast element of that. Why a podcast? Why in this commercial space? And we did it in the podcast because ultimately somebody had to pay for the production, and all the testing we were doing with the various models and the software we had to build in order to make it a two-way conversation with an AI model in somebody else's voice, because of course that tech doesn't exist, so we had to build that, and somebody had to pay for all that. So we found, we were talking earlier about Real Screen, And Real Screen last year, I went and met up with Lara Sword, who works at Night Train Digital, and she had a real passion for understanding the creative space when it came to AI, and we had a chat and went, okay, yeah, let's do it. What can it look like? And I said, well, in that case, the most obvious place is probably a podcast, because we could get these guests on. We can't do the visuals yet, he says, in that kind of, oh, but maybe we will soon, kind of way. And so it became a commercial proposition. So we aimed it at YouTube because that's monetizable. And then, of course, it plays, as we all know, the TV industry is in a state of flux at the moment. And I think calling it a state of flux is the kindest way of describing it.
It's quite diplomatic.
Yes, where we then always discuss the idea of, this idea of digital first. And so if you're going to test out some new content, why not do it in a safe way? And that has actually resulted in a lot of other very, very interesting conversations with other people to say, actually, could we test this out on this space as well? And so to the point that, we've had, I think, 5 or 6 commissions in the last, 6-7 weeks. And that really shows that there is an appetite out there for getting it right if you do it ethically, legally, and responsibly. And that is the greatest. Somebody introduced me on a panel the other day as Deep Fusion was set up in order to take advantage of AI in the workplace, and I said, no, that's absolutely not right. We were set up in order to take advantage of the fact that we knew how to do it legally and responsibly and ethically. And that we had an ethical business model, and that we thought the world was waiting for that. And it turns out that actually, all right, it might have been, we were 7 or 8 months early, but ultimately we were right.
No, I think you went ahead and helped me understand the story with the broadcaster, which is great. I mean, I'm always interested in that origin story. I want to get into the AI of it all and the consumer experience too. But he passed away in 2023. So did you have the idea to do a talk show with an AI, and then you were like, what about him? Or did he pass away and you're like, I wonder what that, what was that spark for
Nothing.
you?
I mean, neither of those two things, actually. So Mike, I'm going to refer to him as Mike Jr. at this point. I don't think Mike Jr. would probably appreciate being referred to as Mike Jr., but we'll go with it for now. So Sir Michael Parkinson's son is called Mike. And Mike was Sir Michael's producer for, I think, 15 years, whilst he was still working and active. And he now runs Parkinson Productions. And of course, as with all notable estates and celebrities and so on, there is this notion of legacy work, I suppose, of making the archive work into the future and keeping what might typically be called a brand alive. And I don't mean that in the cold hard sense, but I do mean it in the sense of his father was one of the most prolific interviewers of a generation. So therefore, keeping his memory alive involves writing books, or it involves, doing talks and things, because, hey, it's your dad. Why would you not want to keep your dad alive and in the public consciousness for as long as possible? Outside of anything else, why would you not want to do that on a personal level? So what was interesting was that he came to us after he found out who we were, because I'd written the policies for or co-written the policies for PACT and Equity, and fed back on various others.
I actually think that's a really important point. Could you let's double click on that, as some people like to say. What are you referring to that you were writing policy?
So 18 months, 2 years ago, or in fact, we can go back even further if you like, if we want a Genesis story. In 2021, I made a documentary called Jerry Anderson, A Life Uncharted, where we were given 36 hours of unheard audio archive from the estate of Jerry Anderson. So Jerry Anderson being the creator of Thunderbirds and Stingray and other things that didn't do so well in the States. So none of you will know what that is. But again, prolific producer in the UK. In the 1960s. And so we were given all of this audio archive, but we were given no visuals to go with it. And it just happened to be at the time that the deepfake Tom Cruise thing came out on TikTok. And I rang Jamie Anderson, Jerry's son and my now business partner, and said, "Hey, how do you fancy resurrecting your dead dad?" And he said, yeah, actually, I think my dad would actually have really, really lent into that. He was into being a pioneer, and trying new things. And so, that did what it was going to do, and it launched and did it exceptionally well. It sat at the top of charts for I think nearly 6 months, and the reviews weren't bad either. And so we then said, "Oh, okay, right. Where else is there a load of audio archive?" And then we can make visuals to go with that. And we pitched it to commissioners and network leads, and they weren't ready for it. It was like, no, deep fake dirty. And to be fair, at that point, the only other deep fakes that were around were either Tom Cruise or pornography. So we're setting a fairly low bar here for what we have bettered. But the network heads were still not ready to go with this. We said, okay, so it looks like we need to sort of show them our ethical process, our framework, our guidelines for how we worked ethically. And that was useful. But then ultimately, industry bodies like PACT and Equity started realizing that actually this wasn't going away and that there might have been an ethical process that needs to be brought in. And so I was contacted to sort of be on working groups for industry bodies. And so I essentially said, right, well, this is the framework that we wrote for Jerry. Does it work for you? And some of it laid the groundwork, and some of it was built upon, and so on. And of course, that was all happening at around about the same time as the SAG-AFTRA strikes and WGA and so on. So I ended up, feeding back into some of that. And there was the Archive Producers Alliance who set up at the same time. And so I'd said, right, look, here's all the guidelines that I've been working on. Can I advise you on that? And that's what I did. Unfortunately, time got the better of me, so I couldn't do everything for the APA, but those early iterations of what they were doing, very, very useful. And so I it got to a point where my handprint sat on most of the policy, certainly all of the policy to some degree in the UK, and to a lesser extent in the US, but ultimately my fingerprints are probably there, and the same in Canada and Australia and so on. And so we then set the company up, Deep Fusion Films, in order to take advantage of the fact that, well, if you've written all of the policy and you know the production landscape, then you should be able to make a business out of the two, and ultimately that came to be.
I mean, I think it's definitely one of these folk tales of these tech booms when, early movers or people that see opportunities early, and in your case, very literally, the fruits of your labor were more than the productions, but also that kind of, sort of in the trenches trying to figure it out of like, how are we supposed to do this stuff? And it sounds like there's a lot of creators on social video that live in a much wilder west of what's okay and what's not in their opinions. I think it's interesting that, you had the accountability of a TV broadcaster, which often puts us on accounting in a different way anyway, but it's really interesting to see how you just kind of had to figure out something that just nobody had written a book on how to do this stuff. I also think it's interesting, like when these tech moments happen, like words that suddenly become a big part of our lives. It's very interesting to me how ethics is a probably trending term on a data. And I think that's awesome. It's so cool that that's part of what's going on here. So everybody's really asking themselves, what is this?
I think there was a wake up moment. Certainly, I can see it on my, on my trajectory, if you like, or and that was last February at Real Screen, where suddenly, I remember, because I've never been one to be particularly in the spotlight, or be quoted or anything else. That has never been my life. And I remember that I did my panel at Real Screen last year on the ethics of AI in entertainment, or whatever it was. Forgive me, Real Screen, I cannot remember what the panel was called. And then my head of commercial messaged me overnight and went, "You're the front page of these magazines." And I went, what do you mean on the front page? And sure enough, there was a picture of me on the front page of magazines talking about AI in entertainment. And then from that moment on, it was like, we've all got it. We get it. And it didn't stop. And then the next ramp of that was because of course at that point everyone's talking about hypotheticals. It could do this, it could take your job and all the rest of it. And then the next time it ramped up was virtually Parkinson, where everybody went, oh, it's now a commercial prospect. And these guys have turned it from being a hypothetical into something where they're actually making money. And I would like to point out that we're not making vast sums on this. It's a podcast. But similarly, we have to acknowledge that, we're being paid to make a podcast. And there are the big sort of issue that most people have with AI is that obviously it's going to take our jobs. We have a picture of us in the booth making the first episode, and there are 14 people in a booth for a podcast. That is ridiculous. Now, whether or not it needs that many all the time is a different question. But there were 14 people being employed on that podcast on that day. And so, it doesn't ring true that whilst it might take away in one area, and as we know that virtually Parkinson literally couldn't exist if it were not AI, because it is focusing on an AI relationship. So you couldn't make it with a human. So but let's imagine a world in which, we are taking a human job, but actually we've created, whatever it is, 7 more than is necessary, on that given day.
I mean, I see so much of and I don't say emotional to put it up or down, but there's a lot of emotions that surround so much of this. And I think the workforce is a big one, and that it is hard to extricate that from the self-inflicted wounds of an industry from recent years. There's a lot there. And I think we do, as people like you who go out and make something, help create ways of thinking about it. You're by default, and it's interesting that you're someone that doesn't say, I don't particularly enjoy being in front of people talking. Like, you're now someone that has something to say that people are curious about, someone that has to answer to people that you didn't know you suddenly had to answer to them. But it's interesting,
On Wednesday, I think it was last week, I was in front of a select committee in UK Parliament, talking about what the media industry wants out of legislation and how quickly it wants it. So this really has moved from being a point where, sitting on a panel going, oh God, I really don't know what I'm going to say, to now feeling quite confident in being able to say, look, this is the journey we've all been on. If we've been engaged in this for the last 2 years, this is the journey we've been on. We've all come together. We've all explored all the avenues. And regardless of what the technology is and that's the thing, is the fact that most people get hooked up on what the technology is. God, the amount of noise around Sora 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, and they go, oh, it's coming. It's like, yeah, but the underlying question is, can I use it? And within the UK and the European Economic Area at the moment, you can't use it. And I don't know for why that they have decided not to roll it out in the UK, or the EEC. But I imagine that there are some fairly stringent copyright laws that you might be a little bit wary of if you didn't want to end up on the wrong side of a legal battle.
I defer to the smarter lawyers on which specific pieces. I'm guessing that's just like the territorial laws are very different currently. But I mean, I think to go back to the idea of what's remarkable is that what we keep referring to, that it's a commercial product. And you've clarified, by the way, no houses have been bought in the last week off of that commercial product, or I'll let you qualify. But I think
very, very small houses, I think.
But to me, what's remarkable in a very nascent space that a lot of people listening to this are all experimenting with, is that means it had to go all the way to the end of the conveyor belt. It actually is now going to be listened to by lots of people. We're going to get feedback from consumers who are accountable to somebody's commissioned investment. That has actually had to go through the rigorous process of really making something complete that for better for worse sits alongside legacy models. And I think that's what's interesting, and what is learned along the way is, and let's lean into technical for a second. Like, I don't know if this is your magic box where you don't reveal the tricks, but we've heard cloned audio before. A lot of us have played with 11 Labs. maybe it's approaching similar skill levels, but it sounds exceptional what you guys fine-tuned here. Can you talk a little bit about what was that threshold you reached? What did it take to get to say this is as best as we can actually say this is virtually Parkinson?
We spent a lot of time working with GPTs and trying to understand how to get a brain to say the things in the style of Parkinson. So there's a lot of prompt work going on there, and understanding, systems and system prompts and so on. And then there was a lot of obviously tying up all the elements and working out the most effective way of being able to tie the brain up with the voice, and understanding what was being said, and contextualization, and tying in, who Parkinson was. And that was, so we needed a standalone system that could plug in to a wide number of other systems that had an offline brain, because we didn't want to put the brain online, because we wanted to, there are risks attached to that. And so everything is closed ended. So you can't access any of this from the outside. It all lives locally. It either lives on this computer that I'm on now, or on a secondary computer that we have as a backup.
And in the category of it's not ready yet, and then someday it's ready, was there a test that the son would come in and say, hang on, got to make sure that's my dad? Or what did it look like when it wasn't ready yet? Was it would just hallucinate, or would it talk funny? What did it look like when what was that journey like? How did it get better?
So there were no hallucinations, because that wasn't the way it was built. But I think some of the bigger questions were actually about interview style, and ensuring that we got an interview style right. And to that end, I'm not sure. I think we've got close in certain areas, but I'm not 100% sure that you can take somebody's entire personality and distill it into an AI. What I've discovered, over the last 2 or 3 months, is that actually the amount of material you need and the amount of prompts and all the rest of it you need to sort of create a real brain of somebody requires far more material than actually the computer can deal with, or the AI can deal with, because actually it gets itself confused and it doesn't know which bit to look at first. And I'm sure that is just a case of modeling. I'm sure that we will get to a stage where actually, we fine tune it, if you like. But there was, our original place. Our first port of call was to say, right, if we can't get the audio right, if we can't get the voice right, we're not doing it. And 11 Labs as an example has, it really struggles with British voices with regional dialects. And so we weren't sure how that was going to pan out. But actually they made a very, very good voice. Very, very good voice. And then Respeecher offered us the same solution. And so it became clear that, actually that was achievable. And then we went on a journey of what are we actually doing? And how close to being semi-call are we getting? How close do we want to get? And then, of course, there's also the commercial aspect of that, is that, well, we've made a commitment to a commissioner at that point that we are going to have this out by then. And of course, so as with any creative project, you end up taking a bit of a journey on where the creative was originally, until you get into the nitty gritty and you work out that actually, all right, well, maybe what we said originally was only 90-80% possible. So then we change it slightly and we learn, and I think that's very important. I had a conversation with somebody who wanted to commission us to do something, and they said, look, we'll give you some development money, and we want you to get stuff wrong. And I thought that was the most creatively freeing thing, to be told, right, here's some money, go and ultimately get stuff wrong. Because it's only when you get stuff wrong that you realize what you can get right. And Night Train allowed us to, Night Train weren't the company that said that direct quote to us, but the relationship we have with Night Train is fluid enough that we can say, right, do you know what? That bit didn't work. But that doesn't negate that there isn't an interesting conversation to have here. And one of the things that came up the other day was that somebody said, I'll probably listen to the first one because I want to know what happens when you have an AI interview somebody, but I probably won't listen to the next one. And I thought about it, and I thought, yeah, if I was making, that's a real issue we've got there, is that actually, if you're not interested in the guest, why listen? And if you've listened to one and you don't like it, why listen? And I thought, I've got it. What we'll do is we'll frame it. So we've now added sections that top and tail the pod with Jamie, Mike. So Jamie being my co-founder, Jamie Anderson, who I made the Jerry Anderson doc with. So Jamie, Mike, and I top and tail each doc. And the first one, we introduce what the concept is, and where we're planning on going, which is to get, as close to a human version of Michael Parkinson, and to reflect his interview style. But we want to maintain the fact that it is an AI interview. We're never crossing that line. And then we're going to explore how close we get to that. And so we're taking listeners on a journey of what it takes to go from where we are at the first to where we will be at the last. So actually, at the end of the episode, we then go through it and go, right, what worked, what didn't, what are we changing, and what are we bringing to the next interview? So that you will see, at the end of that, we'll be very, very open and honest and go, right, okay, actually, it spoke over him then. It didn't hallucinate, but it was, so actually, what was interesting was that Jason decided that he would try and ask Michael Parkinson a question. And we had, in our first one, we hadn't built him to answer questions. We'd only built him to ask questions because he was an interviewer. And Jason got cheeky halfway through and decided he'd throw a question at Sir Michael, or AI Sir Michael. And we all sat there in the booth and went, is this what happens if you Google? Is it going to break? And funnily enough, our head of AI, Christian, had tried asking Parky a question before, and he rambled nonsensically for about 20 minutes. And so as soon as Jason started, I went, oh my God, we might have to kill it and restart it here. But actually on this occasion, what he did was he just ignored the question completely and carried on to the next question. And it was that moment where you go, God, that's nothing like what Parky would have done. So, the next iteration of that was, right, we need to build in the ability to answer questions. But if you're going to answer questions, it needs to have enough of a biography built in to know what he's talking about. And so that was a really interesting additional process for us. And we kind of went, right, okay, let's stop but there was an honesty to it. We go, do you know what? We're not perfect. We haven't built the perfect model. We're iterating all the time. And that, I think, that progress is almost as interesting. I mean, to some people, it would be more interesting than the interview with Jason Derulo. But actually, to others, it will just be a nice hook, because at the end of it, you go, right, well, tune in next time then to work out, see if it worked, and see whether you think anything's interesting that's come out of this. So that's something else that really we've made, a big hallmark of ours is actually we're never passing off. We're never saying, that wherever AI has been used, certainly in this creative way, it's really important to tell the audience that that's what's happening, because otherwise, how is an audience ever going to grow up and learn about what is possible? Unless you flag, right, these are the things, and it becomes part of the public consciousness, and it will take 5-10 years. And the example I gave at the select committee the other day was that there was a program in the UK called Crime Watch. I'm sure you have had a similar program in the US, where you had dramatic reconstructions of crimes taking place. And so in the 90s, when these dramatic reconstructions first started coming in, everybody was horrified. They went, "Oh my God, we're showing people being, kidnapped off the street." And so, you ended up with dramatic reconstruction being emblazoned across the top of the screen to make sure that people didn't think that they were watching, or it was to safeguard actors to say, "Oh, I've seen him. He was in El Dorado," and you go, right, okay, that's not acceptable. Whereas now, dramatic reconstruction is so readily available and readily accepted by the public that you don't need to put dramatic reconstruction in there anymore. But for 5, 10, 15 years, you did. And that's exactly where we are with AI, is that the audience needs to learn what AI is capable of so that it becomes, part of the public consciousness and part of what people grow to learn what it looks like. Because AI still has a style. You could tell, unquestionably, you could tell that the AI interview of, with Michael Parkinson is AI because of certain tells, like the fact that at the end of each question, there is a breath. AI Michael makes a breath, and that breath doesn't go anywhere. But because it's almost it's the breath needed for the next sentence, but no next sentence comes. So you hear the breath and then it cuts off. So for me, that's really, really obvious. I can now tell whenever I listen to an AI piece of audio, there's always a bloody breath at the end of it, because that's what's necessary in order for the AI to get to its next place. And the more that you make the public aware of that, I think the safer the world becomes.
I think you're right. I'm curious. I mean, I've been spending a lot of time with Sora lately, and some of the outputs are pretty amazing. And I do think they will challenge even the sharpest viewer who is in a state of watching something and they aren't told. I also think that arc of at some point people develop a certain type of media literacy is relevant. I mean, I think this cuts to a big question that I think almost points a little bit to your Peter Cushing experience. Like scripted seems to have a whole other layer to all this stuff. There's all kinds of, lawsuits and plenty going on. I'm not saying that they're off the hook, but I think when people saw Carrie Fisher obviously publicly dead, but in a film, it was almost charming to somebody. I mean, I'm sure there was mixed reactions. When Luke Skywalker shows up as not Mark Hamill today in The Mandalorian, people think that's awesome. The de-aging of Robert De Niro in The Irishman, this has been mostly celebrated in the category of look what wonders the Dream Factory is capable of. But something happens when it drifts over into a doc or unscripted that it seems to be poking at something else. It's something that underlies a lot of what we've been talking about today. You had this unique experience with Peter Cushing as this incredible avatar of AI that he's become, that he got to be there early with Rogue One as most of us remember him from the first Star Wars film, and this, amazing villain character that was we're almost stoked that he was back. Wow, he's here. And that makes this movie even better, the Rogue One film. But you also got to celebrate him in a new way. And there was also interesting estate issues that you navigated, and you had the toolkit from your previous experience. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I'm curious how that might be a way to talk about this distinction of how the scripted world approaches this versus how in a documentary you've had to approach this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a lot to unpick there. I mean, I think the underlying questions remain the same, which is about consent, or even further, informed consent, and so.
And forgive me, do you mind introducing the Hammer doc? I think I didn't do that.
Yeah, of course. So I made a. If you're not aware of Hammer Films, God, why not? But no, Hammer Films was a British studio in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. It's taken a few hiatuses across the last 90 years. In fact, it's been resurrected more times than Dracula, but it is now celebrating its 90th anniversary, and I made a feature documentary celebrating the the infamous studio, charting its history between the 50s, 60s, and 70s, as being its golden years. And of course, Peter Cushing was, one of the main two stars, Christopher Lee being the other. And so at the end of the film, and there's an anecdote to this which I think is actually particularly important. At the end of the film, we used AI to animate a still of Peter Cushing in order to get him to say some lines of dialogue from Curse of Frankenstein that he was not on screen to say. And we did that in order for a reveal at the end, which it's not actually come out in the States yet, so I'm not going to tell you what it actually does. I'm going to be all mysterious. But Peter Cushing arrives. But what's interesting is that he appears at a point where actually we did that. So Hammer Films didn't use any form of CGI. Use no CGI, no VFX. And so at the start of the doc, I had the entire production crew round a table, ironically in a church. I don't know why, but it was in a church. And I said, look, we are not going to use any clever trickery here. This is not an AI production. We are not putting AI on screen anywhere because it's not in keeping with Hammer. And that went well, didn't it? And then what happened was that we had hired a former Hammer actress or former Hammer female actor to be our voiceover. And we decided that one of the devices we use in the film is that we have a tarot hag, we refer to her as, who's building a deck of cards and things, and it comes down as our device. As the studio crumbles, so does the deck of cards. And at the end, there's a reveal. And we said, right, well, our voiceover artist, Valerie Leon, she's going to be our tarot hag. So the reveal at the end will be the tarot hag. And everyone would go, oh, look, it's Valerie Leon. This is amazing. And then what happened is that our first choice for VO, who was Charles Dance, of course, being, oh God, what was his name? Lannister, head of the Lannisters in Game of Thrones. Can't remember. Daddy Lannister. And he was our first choice. And we went to him ages ago, long before we had many of the other ideas, and his availability wasn't great, so we didn't go with it. And then he became available just after we'd done all the filming, all the recording.
I think it was Tywin Lannister.
There you go, Tywin Lannister. Thank you for coming back.
I was trying to remember it too.
Yes, excellent Googling on the sly there. So in the end, he became available. We went, oh God, right, well, we can't turn Charles Dance down. That would be awful. But he, funnily enough, didn't want to dress up as a tarot hag and be revealed at the end. So we then had this massive discrepancy between, well, suddenly our devices don't tally up. So who are we going to have revealed as the tarot hag? And so naturally at that point, we thought, well, we could put Peter Cushing into the documentary as our final device, and it was meant as an homage to Peter Cushing, but it was done with, I think, 36 hours to go before the deadline, and so it was. I think it was fair to say that it was impressive in terms of being able to turn it around and get it out and get it all lined up and make it happen. I think that had timing had been different, I think I might have employed some additional techniques there to have rounded it off a little bit, because I think it was perhaps hurried in its delivery.
It's worth noting that, I think when you guys came out with the Hammer doc, this was part of the public's interaction with you as a filmmaker, that I understand we made an AI likeness of a beloved figure, and we want you to understand how we did this. And I think that actually goes back to the point we're trying to make here, which is that we're in a space that the audience wants this. I think filmmakers, in your case of having created the book on how to do this, have built a practice. Like, this is part of what I'm doing here. I need to also share with the world the process to a degree.
You see, that's really interesting that you see it that way, because, I think there's a difference between what gets fed back to me as the filmmaker versus what what public perception is.
Well, there's also the critical reaction, and there's the critics as well.
Yeah, so I get the critical reaction, which is hypercritical, and anybody who didn't like what I did is particularly vocal about the fact that they didn't like it. Whereas people who thought it was okay leave me alone and don't say anything, and the people that thought it was great, that feedback never gets back to me. So I went through that sort of 2-week process after the Hammer doc came out, and I got a lot of stick for, oh my God, how can you? He's a beloved treasure of the Hammer vaults, so you can't possibly touch him, et cetera, et cetera. Now, those are the hardcore fans. So, you kind of expect a level of that, same as you did with Star Wars. But I never hear the other side of that. So if there are people that think actually you're doing something really interesting, genuinely, you're the first person to say that actually there is that space, because I've not heard it.
I guess I think I'm parsing over. I think it's increasingly in this moment that someone might call pre-media literacy settling in, or a phase where this is all very novel and people still need to have their hands held through it, or maybe something that people feel entitled to. There's something about making these choices creatively that I think make it feel like, for the foreseeable future, as the role of the producer is to share these choices and how they were made. Maybe I'm overstating that.
I completely agree with that. And I think there's I think the audience needs a level of insight into why the creative decisions were made and how they were made, in order to ensure integrity and honesty and responsibility, and let alone legality. And to that end, I am very, very happy to be that person, because I know that every decision I make is made with an ethical, responsible, and creative head on. And what's particularly interesting there is the fact that you might be able to, I welcome people to disagree with my creative choices, but actually you can't disagree with my ethical or legal choices, because they are right. And and where they are not clear cut, I am working very, very hard in the background in order to make things very clear cut in the future. And so, and that, what was it? There was, I think there's a quote from Friends, and so here's a diversion for you. So my wife is a massive Friends fan, because obviously that's what most of Britain at a certain age, are. And there was a quote from Monica, which I think is, rules make the fun. And I think there's something very, very interesting in that as an idea, which is that, if you were to tell me, I want you to draw me a picture, I'd go, well, actually, all the limit, with all the possibilities in the world, I that would stymie me for a while. Whereas actually, if you told me to draw a picture, and it had to include the sun, suddenly your brain goes, oh, okay, it goes here, it does this, it does that. And actually being able to be given clear guidelines through which you can work, whether it's, these are the legal specifications for this software and you can do this, or whether you need to get consent before you can do this, then actually the parameters under which all the creativity happens, you're given a safe sandpit to play in. There's no needles in there that you're going to accidentally fall on and kill yourself over. And so actually, and I think that's what the industry is actually crying out for, is something to go, look, there are all these awesome tools, and Sora is an awesome tool, along with many, many others. But I want to know if I'm allowed to play with them, or whether or not actually I'm breaking the law by doing so. Because, the last person I want to, the last group of people I want to harm are my fellow workers, and colleagues and collaborators, and I don't want to be getting that wrong, and I don't want to be decimating an industry by going, to the cheapest option and actually, not working with a shed load of cinematographers or what have you, because humans add to the creative process. So, fine, I can type in, look, this all looks lovely. And I'll go, yeah, it looks lovely. But actually having that bond with somebody else on the team who goes, yes, but have you tried swapping the lens? Because I've used this lens somewhere. And if you actually type in, so-and-so lens on, anamorphic lens on this, then actually it would do another really interesting job. But you need to be able to pay that colleague to sit there. And if it's two of you writing a piece of prompting, well, then that doesn't make sense, does it? Nobody's going to pay for two of us to write prompting where only one of us can get paid for it. So you end up sort of being a race to the bottom. And I think that I think that's going to harm the industry. However, if we find a set of guidelines or rules or legislation that defines what we can and can't do, then suddenly everything's on the table again. And we go, right, actually, we can make awesome stuff. And that means that people can make, you mentioned earlier the difference between what can be permissible on socials and what can be permissible by the commercial broadcast output. And that's really important because there is, as we know, industry being in the place that it is at the moment, there is a perfect storm where what is stopping, creatives, true independent creatives, going online, using all these tools and releasing their material into social media? Nothing at all. And there is nothing that that us as commercial filmmakers or commercial TV executives can do to stop that happening. However, what we have discovered we can do is that we can set our own set of guidelines, because this is what, as an industry, this is what we expect of ourselves, and what we deem as acceptable to not harm our ecosystem any more than we're already harming it. And so we can lay out these guidelines. And then once we agree what those are, we can say, right, well, actually, they can be rolled out. There's a large swathes of this that can be rolled out into legislation. And now whether there's the interest for that to happen, and I suspect that given where the US is looking like it's going to go in 2025, certainly the first half of 2025 with Musk and Trump, who knows where that's going on your side. But on our side, it's definitely looking like that legislation is going to come in that safeguards human creatives, whether that's in the past, the present, or the future. And that, I think, is going to unlock an awful lot of immediate opportunities on this side of the pond. It just then becomes about how that translates, into the US. So what I would say is that I did a tour of most of the major networks and studios back in May earlier this year. And the reaction from the studios there was, if it's AI, I can't touch it. The risk from SAG-AFTRA and the writers' strikes is too great. I'm not touching it. However, if you've got the policy and you've got you've got all the backup in the UK, then make it in the UK and sell it to us, because we can absolutely buy it in, because there's a degree of separation. And I think that is going to come into play in 2025. And it may just shift things in the US.
These are dispatches from the Wild West, sir. And I think it's very much walking the walk that I think we talk about, that in some ways where there are no clear guidelines or policies or things that some people might even shrink at the man or something, like there's still an opportunity that when you are in that puzzle experiment, there's an opportunity not just to sort of make your thing, but also think about, how does this reverberate? How does this inspire others? How does this comfort some people that are nervous about this stuff? It's all these responsibilities that I don't know if all people look at, but I see in the way you approach, the way you've seen your opportunity, that there is an opportunity to go beyond the running time of your project. And I love it. And I thank you for it. And I love how much you have to say about it. I mean, one thing that I'd want to close on, and if there is no answer to this, we'll just come up with a different ending. But we talk about often with, sort of on the mid-journey and runway side of things, that there's this emerging meme that, especially for filmmakers that are used to a lot of precision, there's this happy balance between eventually getting control of the tools that actually delivers what you had in your mind, which most creators like. And then there's this cool thing that AI does that sometimes it surprises you. Sometimes it hallucinates, or sometimes it adds something. Did you have any of these happy accidents in the process of either of these projects or your past projects, that things that were that moment of this could only happen with AI as a creator?
Yeah, I mean, we can go back to virtually Parkinson for a moment on that, which is that because the software that we've built is completely, it drives a completely unscripted conversation. So we would never drive it to go in one direction or another. And so therefore those interviews that come out of it are just completely surprising. So almost the success of the pods is based on the understanding that actually it's AI driven. So we've laid the groundwork, if you like. We've built the house, but what goes on inside the house is completely up to the AI.
Do you have an anecdote of like a moment on set, whether it's a released moment or not, anything that shows us that? Because it's also a unique proposition. It's not just that it looked weird; it sounded unusual, and it's someone who I think I know because it's his person.
So we were having. So I'm going to go back to Jason Derulo. And Jason was a really, really lovely guest. I have to say, I'd not met him before. That's going to obviously come as a massive surprise to everybody, as British as I clearly sound, that me and Jason Derulo have not hung out before. But he was really, really lovely and really gracious. He was giving us this really heartfelt bit of interview about what family life was like and how he wanted to, spend time with his son and make sure his son loved him and so on. And he mentioned the word independence, and AI Parky picked up on the word independence, and made a question out of the idea of choosing independence after the relationships he'd had with Jordan Sparks, and I forget who the other one was that Parky mentioned. And there was an audible shift in the studio as sort of clearly where we were in a really comfortable zone talking about family and love and all the rest of it, and then we went into Jordan Sparks, where clearly there has been some kind of breakdown over time, and he just looked up at the booth and looked at the pair of us sat in there and went, well, that was a left turn, wasn't it? It was like, oh God, we've gone from having this really lovely chat to now something that could go really awkward and, like that. But again, like the responses that came from that were really great, because there was no, and this goes back to the idea that it was an AI interviewer. So there was no agenda. So he couldn't be cross at it, because what's he being cross at? He's being cross at information that is being presented to him through an AI. So he wasn't able to go, oh, I'm not talking about that, I'm not doing it, because it came from a position of ignorance. An AI didn't realize the connotations of going from one to another. And so there was this really quick left turn. But he dealt with it with grace and shared some really, really fascinating insights. And we would not have got that from a human interviewer. Unless you're now about to ask me about my ex-wife.
I'm not going to ask you about your ex-wife. So great. Look, I think it's really possible. This AI space moves so quickly. We've even just seen in the span of this year, like things that were novel are now like every video generator has this certain basic ability to look incredible and blow your mind. I want to applaud you for taking some risks and trying some unusual things. I think the way you even handled the Peter Cushing moment, but it's possible 6 months from now, a lot of these things are becoming vernacular. And that's kind of what's exciting, is we're at this moment that new things are happening, but they're also adoptable. This becomes a new language. From the privileged position of having looked into the near future and had a shot at executing on it, unless this is the secret stuff on your development slate, what's sort of like your moonshot for 6 to 9 months from now? I doubt it's the specific project you can't tell me about, but is there like an idea of what's possible that your unscripted brain is experimenting with that we want to leave our listeners with? What are you experimenting with?
At the moment, virtually Parkinson is an audio only entity. So as in Parky is audio only. There are no visuals of Parky that go with that. And the podcast is being primarily released on YouTube because that's a great way of monetizing things at the moment. It stands to reason that the next step that goes with that is a video add-on. So we need to create Parky in the visuals as well as the audio. And I don't think that's, nobody's going to be massively surprised by that. However, the ability to create live lip syncing and a live driven metahuman essentially, or an avatar, is of course challenging. And we are actively on that, actively engaged on that route at the moment. And I suspect by the end of February, we will probably have cracked that. And the formats that become available to us at that point are very exciting. And that's what I'm most looking forward to between January and May. I think we will. There's another YouTube. There are two YouTube formats that we're developing at the moment that are very, very interesting, and one of them, I think the one that's most exciting for me is actually. Oh, damn it. I wish I could tell you the names of these things. But one of them is particularly exciting because actually, had the TV industry been in a better position, I think we would have struck harder for a TV first deal. Whereas actually we've gone, do you know what? I just want to get this made because of the speed at which AI is evolving. And again, we want to be the first to do the first. And so that is pushing us on a rate of acceleration. But actually, that will be the first true format that does everything that I'm talking about. So it's about the ethics. It's about not passing off. It's doing everything responsibly. It's feeding into people's innate fears, if you like, of AI. So there is a natural ability to look at it and go, "Oh God, really?" And I think that if we get that away, and I think we will, then that will be the next moment where, because as we've discussed, largely we've been in a hypothetical space within a commercial AI entity, and we are the first to have found a format that actually is commercially viable and uses AI in a way that has never been done before. And I think the next one will be that format that I can't name, because it will be visual and it will be a proper, watchable format that you would expect to be able to see on Netflix or a streamer.
So it's the Real Housewives of AI, which we're
100%. Yes. That's. Oh, damn it! That is what it should have been. I've made everything else much more complicated. It should have just been the Unreal Housewives of LA. No, the Unreal Housewives of AI. Damn it! I mean, all of those elements should have been there.
We got to get back in the development room. Before we leave, when can Americans expect to see the Hammer documentary?
So I don't know. I know that it is currently out for distribution in the US, and I think a deal is sort of on the cards if it hasn't already been done. But as you know, there is always a time delay between somebody penning something and then it actually coming out. So unfortunately, I'm not directly involved with that.
And Virtually Parkinson, where can people see that, hear that?
Virtually Parkinson will be out early in the new year. It was meant to be out in December, but we had a couple of guests discover that actually doing things this side of Christmas was problematic for them, so they pushed back. So we went, well, actually, I tell you what, we'll just shift the whole thing back a month. And so cause we want to have 4 in the can before we release. And we weren't in a position to say that at the time that we needed to press go. So I think it'll be the new year by the time that starts.
Well, look, I'm excited for you. It's an amazing way to kick off next year. Pioneering tales, I think, is what we're hearing about this. I think this doing things first energy excites me because that's part of what drives me. I feel like I've seen these hype cycles for new technologies, new medias happen. And there's this amazing opportunity when we run towards them and in some ways do the hard work, the things that don't end up on the screen. In this case, it's a lot of this ethical stuff, a lot of these sort of practices stuff that I don't think are the bumper stickers for Hollywood, but I think in this case, they're essential bits. And it's really cool to see how you've balanced the joy of making this stuff plus the real rigor of doing it right. Thank you. That's it for this episode with Benjamin Field. Thanks everybody for listening today. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel and whatever audio platforms you use for podcasts. And if you're interested in AI filmmaking, please do check out our website. We'd love to have you in our community. We have courses in animation, advertising, documentaries, and the core filmmaking course. We'll see you next time.